Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, joined by Kyle Buller. Wow, I think that's the first time I stumbled on your name. And
Happens.
Ismail L, JD, lawyer, and lead policy counsel at MAPS. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Yep. Yeah. You've been wildly productive in the space, very active. I think the most recent thing I saw you do is be in front of is it the California Senate or House?
The California State Assembly. Yeah, the California State Assembly Health Committee. It's a lot of words. Had a hearing on SB 519, and I had the opportunity to be one of the witnesses. And there's the testimony, which is interesting and impassioned. But then for people who are wanting to nerd out about it, there's like a whole hour-long Q&A after, which was much more challenging for me than reading off of a piece of paper. I'll say that.
Yeah. Getting challenged on this stuff is really complicated, but that's cool to know. And hopefully we can link to. Is that on YouTube or something?
Yeah. I can send a link to be shared for later. So
awesome.
Yeah, appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be talking with you guys.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. We've not done adequate coverage on SB 519, and we really need to be. It's a bit negligent on our part, so excited to do it. But let's first talk about you before we jump into SB 519. Where did you come from, and how'd you get into this space?
Yeah, it's
massive question. Sorry.
No, it's a big one, but it's a good one. I think that it's like, especially within the psychedelic field, there's some sort of additional weight to people's origin stories because so many of us come to the work through some personal something. What do I say? I was born in Fresno, California in the Central Valley, which for those who aren't familiar is about equidistant from LA and San Francisco. It's right in the middle of the state. My parents are both immigrants. My dad was born in India and raised in Karachi in Pakistan and came out here in the 80s. And my mother is Colombian. She also came out here in the 1980s and along with a bunch of her family, a bunch of my dad's family. So I grew up in a pretty multicultural, multi-religious household, like with a lot of Middle Eastern and South Asian influence. I was raised Muslim, a lot of Colombian, South American influence also. And can go more into this later, but I have members of my mother's family who've been involved with psychedelic and theogenic practice for as long as I've been alive. And have, cousins and uncles and aunts and other family members who have been doing this work as facilitators or healers or educators for multiple decades now and have really strong relationships with indigenous folks all over the, North Central South America and Africa. So like there's a part of it where I was, a angsty teenager going to raves that was definitely part of the origin story. But then there was also this path that was kind of illuminated for me by family members in my early 20s. Kind of post 9/11 Muslim upbringing. You might say I was like socially radicalized, politically radicalized by some of that. Was actually really focused on surveillance. And I'm still really interested in issues related to surveillance and civil liberties. That's what really took me to law school. But kept my experimentation, really started practicing harm reduction before knowing what it was as a younger person.
Back to surveillance real quick. Are you a fan of EFF?
I'm a big fan of EFF. Yeah. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, super solid organization doing really amazing work.
Right on.
No, that is the direction I think I might have gone. If it wasn't
for psychedelics.
Yeah. If it wasn't at the time that I was in law school, which was from 2013 to 2016, the opportunity hadn't opened up to be applying policy work to psychedelics, which at the time I thought it was like either cannabis, there's incarceration, other kind of policy in the criminal justice related realm. But when the opportunity opened up to be working with psychedelics, when I actually met then MAPS policy manager, Natalie Ginsburg, she's now been director in 2015, once that opportunity showed up, I was like, this is where I can link all of this stuff that I've been interested in, that I've been doing. So I've been working with MAPS since 2015, but I started working with SSDP in 2013. So I've been in the field of drug policy broadly for about 5 to 8 years, depending on how you're counting.
Amazing. I think Natalie was one of our first guests. Big fan of Natalie.
Yeah.
I heard she was recently involved in the ayahuasca research in Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation or something. So we'd love to get her on to talk more about that. And,
yeah, I'm sure she'd be happy to. There's definitely,
cool.
you know, the possibility of psychedelics as an adjunct or as an intervention for conflict or kind of both interpersonal, cultural, political conflict, I think it's a whole area. Maybe that's too much of a rabbit hole for this conversation, but it's a whole, it's a whole area of work that I think is going to be increasingly emerging for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So you got in with MAPS. Things were still pretty young. So it sounds like you joined maybe the year before the big Oakland conference, which is amazing.
Yeah, exactly. It was probably a year and a half before the 2017 conference. And yeah, MAPS and the Public Benefit Corp, you know, the wholly owned subsidiary, were both, I think in total, probably about 30, maybe 35 people at that point. And I think we are about to hit 120 between both orgs like any day now. So amazing. Yeah, it's the last 5 years have been on a rocket ship. I mean, the conference was a big part of it. Releasing the phase 2 results, I think, was a big part of it. That was at the end of 2016. And then, of course, you know, Michael Pollan's book and everything that occurred over the course of 2018, I think, were the other big catalysts. But yeah, and I think, you know, we're in a different paradigm now, no doubt.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I remember going to the MAPS conference in 2013. I think there was only like 600 people there. And then 2017, it like doubled. And now I'm so curious what it's going to be like in Denver now that like, yeah, things have really kind of, skyrocketed.
Yeah, we're in the super early stages of planning this whole psychedelic week-long immersive. Who knows what's going to happen in Denver in 2023. So it'll be about 2 years from now. I think it'll be June 2023, I think is the plan right now.
I think I put it on the calendar already, but I'll make sure.
Totally.
I'm really excited.
Maybe we'll get the chance at it in person. Who knows?
Odds are good.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, hopefully the virus is handled by 2023. We'll see. Grim. All right. So you have a long family history of kind of psychedelic use, given you've got some roots in Colombia. Is this like ayahuasca type stuff or all sorts of different traditions?
Certainly ayahuasca, which they call yahe in Colombia, especially in the southern part of Colombia, where family members of mine have been doing work. But I have family members that are actually part of the tradition of Claudio Naranjo, who you might be familiar with.
Oh, cool.
Oh, yeah. Beautiful.
And so that does involve work with indigenous psychedelic entheogenic medicine, including yahe. But one of the interesting things about a lot of this kind of Central and South American use, like what they used to call psychodynamic, that became psychedelic psychotherapy, that became kind of what it is now, that's continued to emerge, was this interesting kind of overlap between kind of Western psychotherapeutic methods and indigenous ceremonial methods, and, you know, pulling and drawing from different aspects for different needs, different environments, different situations. So it's I would say it's definitely, you know, my family's engaged a lot with indigenous folks in Colombia, as well as other parts of Central and South America and other places in the world. But it really does fit at that intersection between kind of shamanic, animistic work and what we kind of see as the Western kind of psychotherapeutic paradigm, recognizing that there's benefits and limitations to both of those, and recognizing that for different people, different families, different communities, environments, you know, different contexts are needed and different kind of work is needed. So it's really about like expanding the toolkit. So I feel very grateful and blessed that, like, when I was introduced to this as a this work broadly as a teenager on my own through Arrowhead, like so many of us, you know, like on the internet learning about what could be done with my brain. Thank God for Arrowhead, for real. And then it was in my early 20s that I was kind of, you know, brought into the fold by a family member who was like, hey, this is more than just raves. It's raves too, but it's more than just raves. So that was a big transition for sure.
I'm glad to hear somebody from MAP say that. You know, Rick beats around the bush a little bit too. But yeah, like it's a big point, right? Like, not only harm reduction, but is pleasure therapeutic? Is dancing and movement therapeutic? Duh.
Definitely. But, for me, I think so. Yeah. I think so.
Right. Like, yeah. And I love these arguments recently about like, for certain cultures, it doesn't even make sense to lay down eyes closed.
Totally.
And, a lot of traditions are dancing with group and that's their frame, right, for healing. So a lot to dig into there. We don't need to go there. But I'm feeling really excited to dig into SB519 now. So how do you like to say what SB519 is? What's your preferred pitch?
Yeah. Well, I'll give the pitch and then I might contextualize it a bit because it's helpful to have like a kind of understanding of the landscape. But the short version is that SB519 is, and I believe it's an important but incremental, it's not the whole picture, but it's an incremental step toward transitioning away from the failed war on drugs, specifically by fully decriminalizing the personal possession and use of, I believe, 6 listed substances. The original list was a little bit longer, including ketamine, which was removed in the assembly, which I can talk more about. But I think the list currently includes MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, not from peyote, ibogaine, DMT, and psilocybin, if I didn't already say that. But and a lot of the media attention it's gotten has been focused on it as a psychedelic decriminalization bill. But one thing that I just want to acknowledge is that it's a little bit broader than that in the sense that it also sets what I believe to be some really critical groundwork for future drug decriminalization or even regulated, adult use legalization by also legalizing the use of substance analysis kits, which are kind of in a legal gray area here in California, by kind of making more room for kind of appropriate drug education. It doesn't create affirmatively a curriculum like to replace D.A.R.E, which I would have loved to see, but would have cost a huge amount of money and a lot more political capital than was currently available. But it does a few things to kind of set groundwork for kind of future reforms. And I think the other thing to note is that it creates a commission that will study and make recommendations about 2 big areas. The first one being education, harm reduction, and crisis response as like kind of wraparound social services and support related to decrim.
Yeah.
And then as a secondary but related thing, legal regulated access and what might that look like? Like what would an adult use environment look like? And just to step back, like one thing to put into context is with Oregon, with Measure 109, which is really a regulated licensing adult use services bill for psilocybin specifically. Mm-hmm. What they did is that, law got passed, and within the letter of the law, it set up this 2-year commission, which is in the process of figuring out the details of a bunch of things that were in the law. What we thought we would do with California is go for decrim now, go for decrim for what's possible in the very short term, but then spend 1 or 2 years figuring out the details that we might want to see in a regulated system, but then doing that before a new law is written. And, myself and MAPS has primarily been supporting as kind of like expert advisors to Senator Wiener's office. Like, so when they have questions about the substances themselves, the research, details that they're then having to explain to other members of the California state legislature, we've just kind of supported by being like, hey, here's the information we have. Here's how we think about these things. And have, engaged to as much as we can to be helpful. But we almost didn't. And this is kind of interesting context. Like we were very close to, at the beginning, doing what Drug Policy Alliance chose to do, which is to say, we're not going to get in the way, but we're also not going to support because it doesn't go far enough. And we're like right at the edge where we're like, do we really want to support something that doesn't go for all drug decrim, that doesn't think a little bit beyond just this like realm of psychedelic substances? But I feel like we made the right decision in participating in the conversation, partially because if it were to pass and it's, got decent momentum right now, it would be probably the kind of the most comprehensive decrim bill that has gone through a state legislature. Measure 110 in Oregon also decriminalized the personal use of all drugs, but in mostly very small amounts and also with a treatment aspect. We weren't able to get a treatment kind of program funded by the state of California with this bill, but that's like on the horizon. Like it'd be interesting to see like it's not just decrim, but what are all of the alternatives that we're bringing in to support people who have, their own detrimental use of substances, or just want to change their relationship in some way. So that was a little bit more than just a pitch, but that was like a little bit of context as well.
Super interesting. It's we actually misreported on SB 519, and I was going on a tirade about like, oh, they're calling it decrim again, or no, they're calling it legal when it's really decrim. But it's like,
well, it's confusing because of the like marijuana moment was writing stuff up, but then you went in the bill and there was some language. I remember revisiting it, and the some of the language in there was also confusing, where it was like, wait, is this legalization? Is it decriminalization? They're using some words in there that's making it a little confusing. At least I remember going back and being a little confused.
No, I think your confusion is super valid. My personal opinion, and I think reasonable people can disagree about what's defined by what, or what is the correct definition for different terms. My personal perspective, and the reason that we use the word decrim, is because you're right, Kyle, to your point, the bill makes legal the personal possession and use, right? So a lot of people have called that legalization. And I wouldn't correct someone if someone said that. The reason we don't use the word legalization is because in our perspective, legalization implies that the law is kind of cognizing that actually it has a affirmative framework or awareness of how a product gets to a point. Whereas with this, it's more like an island of decriminalized behavior in a sea of still illegal behavior. So you can't actually, not including home grow. So home grow would actually be permitted by this bill, which is really the one situation. If you're home growing, psilocybin, San Pedro, something like that, and then producing or, processing it and then ingesting it, then you really have, like, you might call it legal because you have from point zero to point whatever. But because practically speaking, this bill is not going to it doesn't create any sort of economic regulatory framework, licensing framework whatsoever. We still see that as just eliminating the criminal penalties for a series of behaviors within a much larger arc of potential behavior and activities. But like I said, like I actually think that there is a little bit of wiggle room here, as far as like what one calls it. But to me, if I were to call something legalization, I would want to see something broader. So I think you could call like Measure 110 legalization for psilocybin services because it has top to bottom licensing, regulation, control, and so on. But yeah, that's just my perspective.
That's how I view it too, and kind of define it. I think that's where I was getting confused how they were framing it, and it was like, so yeah, I'm glad you're bringing this up and helping us revisit this as well.
Totally, totally.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, and I'm always harping on legalize and regulate. Like I'm stuck in this Carl Hart world and I can't get out of it, where it's like we really, like, that's the way, but we have to take all these baby steps to get there and make it look sensible and make people feel safe to vote these things in, right? Complicated story.
One of the it's interesting that you bring that up because I actually have Dr. Hart's book behind me over here. It's funny that you say that because one of the things that came up in the process, or that has come up in the process of working, supporting this bill and just being really interested in all of the political conversations that are happening about it. Because first off, it's very interesting to see how multi-partisan conversations about psychedelics are. And it's bipartisan, but I feel like it's even beyond that at times, in the sense that it's, it kind of cuts through our traditional understanding of who falls on which side of the aisle. And there's a lot of reasons for that, some of which are strategic, some of which are more complex. But the point you made about legalization is interesting because I think it's not like totally a clean break where you have like people on one side of the aisle being like, we're okay with this, we're not okay with this, and people on the other being this. I think that there's quite a few people who are resistant to decrim because they don't see it as, or maybe they see it as an incremental step, but they see it as an incremental step that doesn't solve the problems that would be solved by legalization, which I think is a big shift. I think if you started talking about straight legalization of psychedelics like 5 years ago, it would have sounded super off the wall, and it made sense that you would do decrim and then you'd legalize. But now I think because there's a little bit more awareness, some accurate, some not, about supply side issues, and about how the actual underground market works, there's an increasing awareness that like, oh, it's actually the existence of an underground market that increases the harms, not just whether or not possession is permitted. So I think that there's a little bit of like an evolution or advancement occurring in the public and within, lawmakers and so on around why legalization is really the best move. But then the flip side to what you're saying, Joe, which I think is coming up so much, importantly so, is that what is legalization if not merely permission to commodify and permission to put a product into a market, into the same kind of like market dynamics that, kind of govern every other product that we work with, which comes with a lot of baggage, whether it's, big picture capitalism, whether it's specifically about advertising and marketing or anything in between. Like we can say, okay, legalization will solve certain problems. But I wouldn't say, and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I don't think we can say legalization will solve all the problems and it won't bring up more, because there will be ones that we have to think about in a legal regulated environment as well.
Yeah, certainly will not solve all the problems. The new UN climate report suggests that. Yeah, it's, how do we balance that supply side problem and commodification with the harm of the drug war? And people need to sit with that and struggle with it themselves.
Agreed.
I'm not going to tell you the way to do it. You're just going to sit down and think about that. Like, how many families should be destroyed? Or individuals incarcerated.
Yeah, it's a big question. Yeah. It's one that I think the field as a whole, me, you all, everyone who's listening, everyone who's paying attention, we all need to be in this inquiry. I don't think that there's a very clear, simple way out. And I think it's going to be something that we have to just be doing iteratively, slowly over time and cautiously, responsibly.
So SB 519 has received, well, not the bill, but the bill and a number of organizations have received plenty of critiques from Decriminalize Nature. And I noticed their Instagram post and immediately kind of was holding my forehead going I don't know that you all have enough evidence to make these claims. And I think some of your claims are just straight crazy. But that's me. That's my perspective. But could you speak a little bit about what's going on here between kind of the advocacy groups working towards SB 519 and what they're kind of claiming?
Yeah.
Because they're going so far as to say you can't do home grows of mushrooms.
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's true.
Yeah, that's definitely not true. So I'll share just a couple things, and I want to be mindful because as I've said before, I think a lot of the work that Decriminalize Nature is doing and has done is really valuable and really critical. And I testified in Oakland, for the resolution there when I was actually living in Oakland at the time. At the house, my landlord at the time was one of the city council members. So there was this very wild cosmic synchronicity at the moment for me personally, where I was there's no way I can't participate in this, historic process. And so I want to say that first, because I think a big part of what Decriminalize Nature has been doing and is doing across the country is really cool. And I think that what they're trying to do with this decentralized movement toward decrim is really valuable. And I think that the core, answer to your question, I think has to do with different theories of change. That's kind of how I approach what's been going on, where, a lot of us maybe have a similar goal or similar goals to some extent or another. I'm sure that there's some variation there. But we have different perspectives about how to achieve that. And maybe before talking about the one specific to 519, one good example of that is the issues that have been, coming up over the last couple of years around peyote and mescaline specifically. And I say that because every single actor involved, everyone who you talk to about the issue says that they want to protect peyote. No one wants it to go extinct. No one wants it to disappear. No one, people want it to be available for indigenous practitioners, for people within the Native American church, for people within these different communities that have been using it. But there's a lot of different perspectives about how you protect it. A lot of different perspectives about how you protect it. And what can be done to protect the species, the tradition, the culture, the people around it. So I bring that up because I think that, the questions that have come up around SB 519, which I'll, touch on in just a second, are often motivated by, and the different perspectives in my view are motivated by a lot of the same values. Like, no one wants more people to get arrested. Nobody wants a monopoly. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I certainly speak for myself. And in this case for MAPS, like, no one wants, a monopolization of any one of these products in a future market. Like, I say that very, very seriously and sincerely, like not just saying that for the sake of saying it, but I think that that's not what people are fighting for. And I think when it seems like, we're on the same page, but, other issues come up that imply that we're not actually fighting for the same thing, I think it can cause a lot of, a sense of like fear and betrayal. And I think that, there's a lot of things that are underlying the most recent kind of difference of opinion and tension between kind of some of the organizations that have been involved in the conversation with SB 519. But I just want to reiterate that I do think that there's a lot of underlying values that are overlapped. And it's just a matter of like, how do we achieve this value? So to get into some specifics, one of the kind of primary things that has come up within, the coalition and others watching along with 519 is, I would say that there's three big things that have come up over the course of the bill's life that have, either been controversial or required more engagement. The first one was the issue of expungement. The second was the issue of ketamine. And the third is the issue of threshold limits. So I'll just really briefly touch on all those. So with respect to expungement, in California, there is a process for misdemeanors to be expunged non-automatically. A person can go through a process after a certain amount of time. And in California, also because of Prop 47, all personal possession is considered a misdemeanor, of course, if it's just simple possession. So there's already a method for people who have possession charges for any of these substances to go through a process of expungement. But what we wanted was for that process to be done automatically by the state, which is also what I think the primary goal for cannabis reform. I think it should be the main goal for all drug decrim, where you just get those records off. It's expensive in the sense that it puts a big burden on the state to go through records. And with psychedelics in particular, it's even harder because, the weight or the type, much less the weight of the substance that's seized or that's found, is rarely recorded. And if it is recorded, it's in like notes of the arrest. So we're talking like a very arduous process of figuring out who actually would qualify. I was really disappointed, and we were really disappointed that the Appropriations Committee in the Senate cut that provision, because even if the number of people with psychedelic records related to psychedelics is very low, to me, that doesn't change the fact that we should still clear those records. And just to allude to this, in Oregon, one of the things, there's like some barriers to entry for certain kinds of licenses that have to do with felonies related to certain topics. And that's one of the things I'm worried about. I'm worried that someone with like a felony on their record for growing and selling mushrooms in like the early 2000s or something won't be able to make their mushroom chocolate, whatever that they want to make like in the legal market down the line. So the expungement question, I think, is a really big one that it was kind of the first sacrifice, and it wasn't our choice. It was done because the appropriations was like, California can't afford it, which is a whole vortex of a conversation, which we don't need to go into.
It's obvious how expensive that is. It's a big cost.
It is a big cost, and I still think that the burden should be on the state to do it. But that's why it got cut. That was the first thing that happened. The second was the ketamine issue, which was quite a lightning rod, actually. And we fought really hard to keep ketamine in because, in our perspective, the more likely a drug is to be adulterated, the more important it is that people have access to safe supply, which is easier done through decrim. And ketamine may be getting, adulterated to some extent with fentanyl here in the Bay. Like I've heard, not super confirmed, but not unconfirmed reports, and DanSafe has now been coming out a lot about the fentanyl and a lot of drugs that aren't just heroin and cocaine.
Yeah, Denver, it's ugly.
Yeah, there was 2 overdoses just last weekend. So I think that that, to us, that means that the more dangerous, or what this really means is like likely, it's like frequency of use, it's ease of access, it's a bunch of factors, but ketamine is highly available in California, and it's probably the most commonly or most frequently used on that list, frankly.
What was the reason for taking that off? Is it because it's already medically used?
That was one reason, but there's a bit of a rumor going around that there was pressure from ketamine clinics in California to keep it off.
Oh, interesting.
I just want to dispel that rumor. I did not hear anything about that, having paying a lot of attention and talking to people who are in clinics. So if that were happening, it's not something that was made aware of. And I think Senator Wiener has already said that that wasn't a factor. So I just want to dispel that rumor. The main thing that did come up repeatedly was DEA has a claim on their website, which I don't think is very well cited, that ketamine is used as a date rape drug. And I believe that ketamine is used as a date rape drug. I'm not going to say it's never been used or is not used that way. But to me, the fact that a drug can be used for malicious purposes itself is a problem with people, consent, safety, a lot of other things that aren't just the drug. But that was the reason. There was someone early on was like, oh, this can be used as a date rape drug. So we can't allow it to be legalized, which is, and just to be totally clear, even if one legalized or decriminalized personal possession, it would not permit non-consensual giving of the drug to someone. I mean, I hope that's obvious, but it was not obvious to the legislators in question, who were like, no.
Crazy we have to say that.
It is, unfortunately. Because it would still be assault. It would still be, rape. It would still be all of those things. So, unfortunately, that narrative did take the day. Ketamine was also removed from the bill in the early stages of it being in the assembly. And then most recently, there was it's hard to call it a request, because I don't think the bill would have made it through the Assembly Health Committee without this compromise. But basically, the Senator Wiener was told by the Health Committee in the Assembly that the bill would not make it through without some sort of threshold limits, personal possession limits. And this is where I think the most controversy has come up, especially in the recent past. And it's a tough thing. The first thing I'll say is, we being myself personally, and a lot of members of the coalition that I was working in dialogue with, including Decriminalize Nature, all pushed back against the idea of there being limits at the very beginning. But it was known early on by everybody that the likelihood of this bill getting through the California legislature with no limits was very low. But we decided to start with none, recognizing that was a stronger position. And also it's justifiable in the sense that there should be other things determining whether or not someone falls into a category that's, going to continue to be criminalized. And our position is that distributors should not be criminalized. We're happy that personal possession is included in here, but we'd like to see that go further. But to the extent that that was not possible, that creating a commercial regulated sales market was not possible, we had to, keep our imagination focused on this kind of realm of personal possession and use. And what we were worried about was that the limits that would get chosen were the same ones that were in Measure 110 in Oregon, because I think that and we think that those limits are quite low. They're not, they're quite low, and they may protect some individuals who are holding literally their personal amount of one thing. But one issue that we were thinking about a lot is that, with ayahuasca, one person doesn't walk around with their 1 ounce of ayahuasca. You've got someone who's holding on behalf of other people. So the idea of making it possible so people could possess multiple amounts, aggregate large amounts, and then aggregate amounts so they could facilitate in that situation would be ideal. So our team made some recommendations about what those limits would be. And it was when it was in the aftermath of those limits kind of getting proposed by the Assembly Health Committee and then accepted by the senator, that a lot of stuff blew up, implying that MAPS, for example, and me personally, were intentionally adding limits to make it easier for future industry. And I think that that's a pretty egregious mischaracterization of what actually happened, which is that some people in the coalition, including Decriminalize Nature, said that they would not compromise, that they would not ask for any limits. So when the conversation came up about whether or not this bill would get through the committee with limits, they kind of excluded themselves because they had said that they were not interested in negotiating or thinking through it. And then when it was revealed, even though I don't think any of this was ever really secret, that we were involved in providing recommendations because we did say we would negotiate on them, but we would think through them. We kind of got painted as like wanting to create these limits for the sake of all this stuff. I'll say I've been talking for a bit. I'll say one last quick thing, and then we can go into whatever more detail, which is it's really important to clarify that the lack of limits in the bill does not mean, the original lack of limits in the bill does not mean one could possess unlimited amounts. What that means is that there is discretion for law enforcement, prosecutors, and judges to determine what the threshold is for personal possession versus distribution. So by creating limits, by naming limits in the bill, you create a safe harbor where below that amount, people are safe. They know that they have below the amount that could be considered distribution. It's true that adding limits does create an explicit threshold where above it would be easier for a prosecutor or law enforcement officer to declare that something is distribution or something that's still illegal. But the idea that not having named limits means unlimited possession is not real. What that means is that it's unknown until there's an arrest and a case that determines, in which case it's going to be the judge determining, the prosecution determining what that limit is, as opposed to the people who are actually advocating in support of the bill. So I just want to clarify that because I think that there's an idea that like if we didn't have limits, we could possess unlimited amounts. And that's not true. That's not a thing that could have been possible at any point. So I just want to provide that frame. I'm happy to go into any level of detail, so ask anything.
Yeah, with the decrim bills that have passed in multiple cities, are there limits there? I know, like when Denver first passed the psilocybin bill, they just said for personal use and didn't define what that meant. And I do remember that, with the decrim nature aspect, that was one thing that they brought up because, setting limits is going to increase arrests, and this is still going to create a bunch of issues here.
Yeah.
But I wonder if some of those other decrim bills have limits on that as well. As far as I know,
they don't, which I think is great. And one differentiation to clarify here is that if any of these substances were to be decriminalized at the state level, what that means is that neither local law enforcement nor local prosecution, local being within the state, have that tool, can use the possession of these substances for arrests. I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that if we create limits, there's going to be an increase in arrests. One of the reasons that the municipal bills are able to go forward, that's not just Decrim Nature, but what's going on in Denver and other places, is that, two things. One, enforcement of criminal law happens at the state level, not at the local level. So although local law enforcement may not be putting resources toward making arrests, that doesn't preclude a state prosecutor from putting charges forward if, for example, like highway patrol or any law enforcement agency that's not bound by that city's rule decides to make an arrest. It doesn't prevent investigations, that all that can still happen. And the other thing is that the reason I think it's not super, it feels a little bit disingenuous to imply that there's going to be an increase in arrests is because if you look at any of these cities or states, the numbers of arrests for these substances are very, very low. And at this point, don't necessarily believe that there's going to be an increased amount of money spent by law enforcement officers to go after groups of people that are already not known for causing any sort of trouble. In the most recent health committee hearing, there was actually at least one district attorney's office, I think in Southern California, that called in support of 519 because they're already not prosecuting or making arrests. Like when you're a city government and you're spending $0 on prosecuting ayahuasca circles, and then someone tells you, hey, don't spend any money to prosecute ayahuasca circles, then the city's going to be like, sure, fine, we're not, So I think, and that brings me to, I think that's why also getting all drug decrim on the books is so hard, because there's tons of money for enforcement into meth, heroin, cocaine, this quote unquote scary drugs. So I think like that's where it's actually not as big of an ask, in my opinion, to have the state decriminalize, let's say, personal possession and use of something like ayahuasca, because that's not really where the state's already putting its resources toward. And the flip side to that, and I think this is the legitimate critique of something like 519, is that, well, if we go for or Decriminalize Nature, any of these approaches, including a lot of the work, like I said, including 519 and so on, is if we don't, what if we decriminalize, some of these psychedelic substances based on the premise that they're safer, or based on the premise that they're good for you in certain cases, in certain situations? I feel like that could really undermine efforts to be decriminalizing on kind of criminal, legal, or human rights grounds, where it's like, it doesn't matter if the drug is good for you or not. People shouldn't be thrown in jail for ingesting it. So I think that's another like sticky point that I think we as a movement really need to be talking about. So we're not leaving behind users of other drugs. And I think that it's possible to do so with, intentional but incremental change. That was a lot all at once. So feel free to ask questions.
This is a really important conversation, by the way. This is great stuff. So like what are right now the politicians largely kind of reflecting back to you or putting back in your court? What's like the biggest topics they want to solve before they feel comfortable going forward?
Yeah, I mean, in California especially, there's a few, like, you might say, like, hot button things that are like, always brought up when we hear drug policy being talked about. I would say the two biggest ones are probably like fentanyl specifically, and like, generally overdoses and the overdose crisis. And then also homelessness. Like those are probably the two things that, I hear politicians and other public figures most associate with this. And I understand, the concern that people who are already highly unsupported are going to have all this access to all these substances that will make them more of whatever. I understand that concern. I think that, and I guess the third thing might be like, think of the kids. So it's actually none of the things that I've been hearing come up are like the most sophisticated responses. They're mostly kind of the same old drug war rhetoric with a bit more of a modern twist. And the irony to me is that, like, yes, the overdose crisis is a very real thing that I think is going to require like a multidisciplinary, multi-agency approach, maybe even a multi-state and federal approach. It's just going to require a lot of money, a lot of support. But, and this kind of goes back to the ketamine thing, where I'm just like, if we know that a drug is more likely to be adulterated, is more likely to be a risk, why are we keeping it in the underground where there's no accountability for people who adulterate it with actually, with substances that are significantly more harmful or have more of a toxicity profile? And it's an approach question. It's like, to me, that makes perfect sense because I've been thinking about it and we have our perspectives, whatever. But I think to policymakers and lawmakers who are, they might be really interested in the research. They might be like, wow, it's really cool that this research is being done with veterans and victims of sexual assault. And like, it looks really promising. But then the question, which I think is a good question, is like, well, then why don't we just move this forward with all of those safety controls, with regulated services, with training? And my personal perspective is that, having a regulated system in which training, quality control, et cetera, are available is ideal. And I think even with that, over regulating it or putting overly onerous licensing, I think is also a problem for some of the reasons I think Decriminalize Nature brings up, actually, which is that it makes room for big operators, but it doesn't actually leave room for like kind of people, the person to person microeconomies, which to me is the way that I think this movement ought to be looking, is toward like the cooperative solidarity economics models. I'm not, and in the process of, and I think that's one of the things that I hope this commission looks at in California, which is like, what are the ways for the law to incentivize more creative business structures that reduce the likelihood of monopolization, market capture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that's going to be a needle that I think we're going to thread like one little piece at a time, I think.
Right. This is a long project. Kyle, what were you going to jump in with?
No, I was going to say, do you think that creating these models and just thinking about regulation and distribution like causes a little bit of like, I guess, like, I don't know, tension or whatnot of pushing that agenda forward with policymakers? Because I mean, when I think about that, I'm on your page. It's like safe supply. I mean, if people are doing it, the most logical thing is making sure people get safe supplies, not having it criminalized, making it a public, health issue. But yeah, I wonder if like just like trying to create this economic model, if it's like confusing, who gets ownership over what? Do we, this kind of like, co-op model, micro things. We don't want to have anything to do with that. Maybe
Well, it's a good question. It brings up kind of, I think, the core themes of what we've been talking about, where this bill was very explicitly stated. This is a personal use bill where they wanted to explicitly create room for group experience, for facilitated experience. And one of the things that we've been thinking about is how group use or facilitated use is safer use. And this is true of all drugs, I would say. Not like that everyone needs a guide to go through every drug experience they have necessarily, but that it's safer for people to use in groups, even if we're thinking about overdose risk, et cetera. Like, generally speaking, I'm not saying that people shouldn't use alone, because I think there's an environment and context in which that's appropriate. But I think that the general thing is that group use is safer. However, to your point, Kyle, like there wasn't necessarily room in this bill to be thinking about all of those questions about the economics. I feel my personal perspective is that, a lot of those economic questions that you asked are obvious in the sense that like once you start thinking about like the flow of access to a substance, like they come up eventually, no matter what, inevitably. And I would say that there's kind of a split where, part of the reason I feel like it makes sense for this bill to be going forward is because one thing that we do know is that criminalization of behavior does not really deter use. It doesn't keep people safer, et cetera, et cetera. I would not say that we know conclusively what that regulated legal economic system for distribution is. I would not say that we know that yet. And that's why I think it's like, that's the bring in the coalitions, bring in the people to talk about what would be the right way to do this. I'm really inspired by, the whole push for social equity within cannabis. I think that there's a lot we can learn from that whole track. It's not going to cover everything. There's a lot of stuff with psychedelics that are very different than cannabis. But to me, it's like those are the exciting questions that I want to spend the next 2 years really thinking through. But I would say that there's a split where some people are like, okay, yeah, it makes sense to do decrim first because that's just removing a thing that we know doesn't work. And some people, I would say, and if you or folks who are listening have a chance, it's worth maybe listening to the Q&A in the California State Assembly Health Committee after my testimony. There's like a longer conversation but because some of the questions that you're asking are coming up, like came up in that time, which is like, well, how do people get this stuff? And the answer is still illegally until we have a better system that's dialed in. But no one really has a super clear answer on what that better system is. There's a lot of ideas. But I will say lastly that there is an agreement. There's a general agreement, I think, that like the over corporatization is a bad thing. And that's not just from activists. I think lawmakers also agree with that. Like, I think that what they've seen in cannabis is multi-state operators that buy up, licenses, properties that end up becoming very, outsizedly influential figures, and keeping out people who may be either better suited or closer tied to a community or something. I don't think people want to see that repeated with psychedelics. So it's not as like clean as like everyone's against this and for this. It's like I see nuance, which is it's
complex.
Nice. Yeah. I don't see nuance as much with like some of the ketamine stuff. There's some things that are still very like think of the kids. There's no compromise there. But and I'm like, well, the kids have ketamine. I'm telling you that they all have access to it, whether you want them to have it or not. So
it's true. Yeah, like the frequency, I guess let's address this real quick. So why is ketamine so popular? Ketamine is popular because you can be in and out of an extreme state in a less than an hour, no hangover the next day. There might be some biological issues downstream, but it's kind of minor. Well, not minor, but rare.
Yeah, and you have to do a lot for an extended period of time to have.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and the supply it's readily available. Like, think about how little paramedics make if we wanted to go there, and how easy it would be for them to divert ketamine after administering some from a vial.
Yeah.
Low paid workers, high margin kind of diversion, I guess. And there's probably more angles too than just that. That's just one I can think of.
Yeah, I actually am not personally super educated on where a lot of the underground ketamine is sourced from. I imagine that some of it is sourced that way. I'm sure some of it is coming in from, outside of the US.
Right.
But regardless of where it's coming from, like you said, there's a lot of it. And it's become way more popular in recent years. I mean, it's been popular for a while, but I think for all the reasons you said, it's becoming more and more accessible. And, there was definitely an acknowledgement within, the conversations that were being had over the course of the process of this bill, internally and externally, around like, okay, people acknowledge that it has medical value, that it has mental health benefits when used in the right environment. But I think also because of the no hangover thing, you can redose more frequently. It doesn't have the same like rapid tolerance increase that something like LSD or even mushrooms do, where like people can use it more frequently without it, not working or whatever it is that happens with their substances. So all of the above, I think, make it a lot more accessible and like easy. And to me, that means that there should be better education about it. Like one of my on my wish list for this bill, that we'll see if it happens with the commission. But like, I think, people don't know that mixing ketamine with benzos or mixing ketamine with alcohol is dangerous. Like, people really don't know that because it's so common to use all of the above. And, stuff like that I think would just be like low investment, very high benefit from a safety perspective, for just the average user, but not yet.
Oof, yeah. Like the degree to which ketamine is used in Colorado is like mind blowing. I'm sure it's similar in California.
Yeah.
I'm close to the recreational scene, so it's it's an interesting thing. Partly because I've never actually used recreational ketamine. I've certainly actually like experienced it in a clinic and with surgeries and stuff, but it's really interesting to me that I actually haven't even tried it outside of a clinic, Yeah. So people, it is addictive, right? That's another part. Like there can be an aspect of addiction, habit forming, like, and at those high ends, like you were saying, I think our mutual friend Raquel Bennett was saying something like a gram a day, like, and that's a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's when we can see these kinds of situations with bladders having issues and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm cautious about when and how I use the word addiction, but it can definitely be habit forming. And although I don't believe it can cause like physical dependency in the way that benzos, for example, or like opioids can, it absolutely can cause psychological dependence and like severe habitual use issues. So, and again, like all of this to say that it's like, it's not, is this a perfectly safe drug that will never harm anybody? I mean, we know that I think it's, that the more likelihood, the higher likelihood there is of it being, used in a way that's harmful to someone, the more important it is that there's better education. Because I think, interestingly, because of the narrative of it being used for depression and so on, I hear a lot of people who utilize it semi-recreationally, semi-socially, but from like a medicinal perspective. But they don't have, a support system. They don't have, guidance. And I think that it's easy to trick ourselves. And I say this with no shame or disrespect, right? But I think we as people, as humans, it's easy for us to trick ourselves into kind of thinking that what we're doing is good for us. And, maybe it is to a certain extent. I don't want to like undermine it, but there's no question that there's higher risk, I think, in those ways that we just described than there are with other substances, probably lower risk of like psychological distress. Whereas with something like mushrooms, we're talking about little to no physical risk at all, but a higher psychological risk, for someone who has certain sensitivities and so on. So yeah, no doubt.
Right. And this is a kind of across the spectrum with substance as well, right? Like people saying, oh, I'm just smoking weed because it feels good. It's like actually kind of a self-medicated, somewhat medical frame.
Right.
Same thing with clubbing and raving, right? Like a lot of us are somewhat obsessed with that world. And because it makes us feel good, it actually sustains us for sometimes months afterwards, if not longer.
Totally.
And, Burning Man's probably a great case of that.
Totally. And I think to your earlier point, and actually this also goes to what you were asking, Kyle, around like what was being asked and what we're hearing. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of stigma against recreational use. A lot of stigma against recreational use, in the sense that, there's a general sense like, oh, if you have PTSD and you're getting access to this treatment in the underground because you have no other choice and you've tried everything else, then it's okay. You're like a consumer that we support. But if you're doing this like in a rave or at a party or with friends, like you're bad, and not allowed. And I think that the points that both of you have made, I think, are kind of trying to break the idea that those are totally separate things. And that's my personal perspective. And I know that Rick feels this way. And a lot of us at MAPS came through kind of the rave world where it's like, okay, yeah, like it's true that I was going to a lot of parties, where I was having a lot of my early experiences with a lot of these substances. And also it was celebratory and joyful and pleasurable and awesome. And it was also healing and also spiritual, and also all those things. And I saw things go really badly. And that's actually one of the things I think people miss when it comes to, and I don't need to explain this to you guys, but I think that when it comes to the movement, I think anything to me that implies that psychedelics are like a silver bullet that are just going to fix you, I take a lot of issue with that perspective. I think it's really important to be like full spectrum about the benefits and the risks. And one of the benefits is celebrating in a community with friends. Like that is one of the things that I think can be deeply, deeply healing and transformative, whether it's a rave with psytrance. Okay, maybe not psytrance, but some other electronic music genre. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to hit on the psytrance people. But or it's like a really formal therapeutic context. I think like both of these are legit and should be allowed. And also like in medicalized therapeutic context, like that power dynamic is real. Abuse can happen. Yeah. And in rave settings where there's no real support, like things go wrong and people have accidents and, people have, super severe psychological issues related to that too. So it's not like there's no, like this side is clearly the best and this side's clearly not. To me, it's just a whole landscape of a bunch of nuance.
Really is. I mean, I've talked about this on the show, but, I came into this very from the spiritual, intentional use in the woods with maybe one friend or kind of like eye shades. I never really was much of the festival goer, but, hearing everybody talk about their experiences and just trying to be open and find benefit in it. I think that's important for us to be curious and to stay open about how people use these substances and how they find benefit in it, instead of staying like very narrow-minded. And I could definitely feel that at one point where, going down the therapy track, I'm like, oh no, it's got to be done in therapy, but finding, I think even now more than ever, I think we're realizing how important human connection is. Definitely. Coming out of like isolation. We are social beings, and we need that. And can we celebrate that and just enjoy it at times? Yeah. Why does it always need to be a negative thing?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And what you just said, I think is super critical because you can experience human connection in a lot of different settings. And that type of human connection can be healing for people in a lot of different ways. And to me, different people have different needs, which means different settings, which means different substances, which means different kinds of guides, which means different kinds of support. Like it's just not a one size fits all. And I guess that's a good lesson to draw from the psychedelic experience anyway. There's really not a one size fits all thing going on here.
Which makes me wonder, I guess, like your vision, like if you were to draft some policy and change, like what does the future look like in your mind? Like what would be ideal?
I would love to see medicalized access within the healthcare system for people who need that type of care. Insurance coverage, ideally with universal healthcare that also covers mental health, like that would be nice. You know, so I'm talking state-funded psychedelic therapy for everybody. I think simultaneously there should be regulated adult use frameworks for people who may not need all of the structure of a medical setting, but should be able to use it without. And to me, and this is a longer vortex, but to me, it's the question of like of diagnosis. Do you require a diagnosis to have access to care or not? And generally, that's shorthand for a distinction where medicalized use means you need a diagnosis. Non-medicalized use means you don't, or as an organ, you're only not allowed if you're contraindicated because of diagnosis. And then lastly, I would say, and that to me looks like the whole range, right? That looks like farmers markets and cooperative economics and gardens where communities can do education and co-growing and, you know, experiences together, to like the more kind of dispensary style storefront approach. Although I have mixed feelings about how that specifically is going to roll out, because I think that it can go in a lot of different ways. And then lastly, there should not be criminal penalties for people who are violating these things, right? Like I think that if you're using outside of either of those paradigms, you're growing your own, you're going to a park and harvesting, like you should be able to do that without fear of any sort of prosecution, even if there are companies who are operating within the space, which is, and that to me is like the underlying fear of a lot of what came out with the threshold thing, which is like, there's a legitimate fear that, you know, if there's legal access through some routes, that those other routes are going to be more criminalized. And I don't think that that's a foregone conclusion. Like, I think that that's possible if we let them do that. But I think that, you know, there's a fight to be had for it. So to me, it's medical access, legal use, decriminalized use. And legal use can include spiritual context. It can include, you know, like therapeutic, maybe not therapy specifically, but therapeutic, and also celebratory and all these other kind of situations. So I believe, maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic, but I think it's possible that these things can coexist. And that's kind of like where my best case scenario would be. And I guess I would just add fully unarmed, well-funded crisis response and prevention.
Yeah.
Harm reduction services at every site that drugs might be used, and a real education system that starts in junior high school and that teaches honest curricula about drugs. Like, I would say those three things with that framework, and we might end up at Star Trek.
Whoa. I've said that on the show. The Star Trek future you know is possible.
I mean...
I'm an addict. Kyle, are you in on that yet?
No, somebody just brought Star Trek up, and I said, I haven't really gotten into it. I feel like this is the sign. Maybe I should start watching it.
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm fronting a little bit. I'm like basing that off of cultural context. I'm not exactly the biggest Star Trek person, but I know that it has to do with like some sort of collaborative society. So
exactly, very inclusive society. It's fascinating. Yeah. And there's a number of people, big thinkers, who use it that way. So I think we're a little bit over our booked time here, but Izzy, it's been awesome having you. And this is really great insight. And I'd love for you to contribute more in the future if you're up for talking more about SB 519 as things develop, or any other fun stuff.
Yeah, we'll have we'll know if it gets out of the Appropriations Committee on August 23rd. Or 26th, maybe, actually. And then if it gets through that, then it would be heard on the Assembly floor on as late as September 10th. And then we'll see what happens from there. So hopefully, maybe next time we talk, we have good news and a lot more nuance to discuss, no doubt.
Amazing. And where can people find you online?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So obviously you can find MAPS online, www.maps.org. You can also find me personally on Instagram and Twitter at Sage_Izzy, SAGE_IZZY. And I try to keep in I try to keep involved in the Twitter discourse. I feel like a lot happens on the internet. So please feel free to reach out and say hi. And while you're at it, and while I'm here, check out, Chacruna, our dear friends at Chacruna Institute for Sacred Plant Medicines. Shout out to you all at Psychedelics Today for having this kind of awesome platform. And again, I really appreciate the conversation and what y'all are doing.
Yeah, thank you for the time.
Yeah, and I was supposed to give a shout out, birthday wishes to Court Wing, awesome. NYU trial participant, good friend, all that. It's been a great project with him so far. So
awesome. Happy birthday.
All right, everybody, let's kind of wrap recording here. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll see you on the next episode.